You're listening to the Pink Tax Podcast, where being a woman costs more and we've got the receipts. From overpriced razors to underpaid roles, we're talking money, power, and the price of showing up. Let's get into it. Welcome back to the Pink Tax Podcast. And this is episode 1 of, I think, season 6, and it has been a while. And a lot has changed in these past few years since the podcast launched in 2019 with my co-host at the time, Tara, who is still a very dear friend, just does not have capacity to be on the podcast, and we miss her dearly. But I am bringing back the podcast because I feel like I have a lot to talk to you all about when it comes to financial education, financial empowerment, and women's economic equality, because that is something that I am so passionate about. Hi, my name is Janine Rogan, and I am the founder of the Pink Tax Podcast. I've been in the financial education space for 14 years now. And I wanted to share my story with you today and why I'm bringing back the podcast, because for many of you that listened through our first 5 seasons, we recorded through COVID. We started it right before COVID. And then I think it was like 2021, I had a young child. So did Tara. We were both doing our masters, and life just felt really chaotic in trying to squeeze in the podcast. So we hit pause. And it just kind of never came back or was a priority until, I don't know, this year. I just had this calling that in 2025, I was going to bring back the podcast. So I'm bringing it back solo. I am so excited to bring guests on this podcast. I have a number of fantastic interviews lined up for this season, and I'm always taking requests for potential future guests. You can email me at hello@janinerogan.com. But let's get into my story and the why behind the Pink Tax Podcast. So when I think about my money story and where I started, it actually starts when I was about 3 or 4 years old. Now, I grew up in Edmonton, and when it was summer, we decided to have a lemonade stand. And I corralled these like 2 twin boys that lived down the street from me into creating this lemonade stand with me. And at that point in time in my life, I did know the difference between a loonie, a toonie, and a quarter. And I think we were selling lemonade for like a quarter. However, I convinced these 2 boys that all of the coins were worth the same amount. And then when it came time to divvy up the proceeds, I took more of the loonies and toonies in my pile. Well, my dad came and audited how we had split the money. And he knew full well that I knew what the difference of each of the coins were. And he didn't call me out in front of these other 2 boys. He just, taught us all. Maybe he thought I forgot. Unlikely. But he taught us all kind of the value and showed us how to divvy it up equally. And I liken that maybe to potentially fighting the patriarchy at a young age and realizing that maybe there was a wage gap all along, and so I needed to take more of the money. But I think, it really just speaks to us, even as young kids, we want more of money because we know what money can do for us. And I think that's kind of what we're all after here, is being able to feel economically independent, to make choices that are in alignment with our values, and ultimately to not have to worry about money. So that was kind of one of my very first money memories in maybe entrepreneurship. And the second was, we had this crabapple tree, and every year all these crab apples would fall, and my grandma would come and she would make crabapple jam. But one year, another little kid I convinced to start a business with, him and I decided that we were going to fill our wagon with crab apples, and we were going to wash them with water from, I think, the hose at that point. And we were going to take these crab apples and we were going to sell them. And we were selling them for 5 cents a piece. Well, as you can probably imagine, not many people on our block wanted to buy some crab apples, but we did manage to sell 3. So we made a whole 15 cents. And I think, again, this maybe speaks to why I'm an entrepreneur. There were lots of opportunities throughout my life where I've kind of taken the entrepreneurial road and maybe hadn't realized it. But I definitely look back and see at a young age that I was passionate about running my own business and making money so that I could probably at that point buy candy from the drugstore, from the place down the street that sold, I think gummies were like 5 cents back then. It was a different time in the 90s. But that is where kind of my money story started. And then I remember growing up and really being encouraged to save money. I remember I had this little bank book that you would put in. I had a Leo savings account at RBC. You would put the bank book in and it would go back and forth and show you how much interest you were earning. And I thought that was fantastic. It was always like a couple of cents here and there, but over time your money would grow. But nobody ever really talked about things that I think are really important now, which are investing and salaries. So how much money people made, because I truly don't think I had any idea how much money people made until I was an adult. And I think that we do a disservice for young people when we don't talk about those things. I was a dancer growing up, and I remember at one point, I think every dancer thinks that they're going to go off and be a professional dancer. But I remember my mom telling me that dancers really didn't make a lot of money. And I don't think she meant it as like you should only follow a career that makes you money, but I think she was trying to warn me that the lifestyle I would lead would be very different than if I went to university. And I remember her saying that like dancers made $20,000 a year. And I was like, that is so much money. $20,000? Like that's like an obscene amount of money. Obviously, also didn't realize how expensive life was, rent and groceries and all of the things that I enjoyed, travel. But $20,000 at the time seems like a lot of money to me. So those were kind of the conversations we had in our household around money, but never really anything around investing and building your wealth. And I really am so passionate about that for women, because I really do think it gives you the opportunity to be economically empowered, to be financially free, and to actually have choice. Because when you're choosing between going to work at your 9 to 5 or your hourly job and staying home with your kids because they're sick and you're worried about repercussions at work, that's not really a choice. We like to frame it as a choice, but you are dependent on that income. So it really isn't a choice. You can't choose to actually take time away. You can't choose to make less money and start a business, which is kind of what happened to me. And I will get into that as well. But being financially independent is so freeing. And I do really, really believe that building wealth is a form of self-care. And as many of you know, I have written the book called The Pink Tax, and I do have a chapter in there called Building Wealth is Self-Care, because while we can say that like bubble baths and glasses of wine and skincare, all of those things are self-care and those things are great. I'm not against any of them, and I do all of them. Real self-care is having an emergency fund that can get you through a year of being unemployed, or having an investment portfolio that pays you an income that allows you to work part-time or travel to a different country for a while, or take a step back from the workforce and volunteer. That is true self-care, because I can tell you when the pandemic hit and nobody knew whether we were keeping our jobs or what was happening, having a cushion of money that I knew could sustain us for multiple years if we needed, like if both of us lost our job the next day and there was no EI and whatever, that was just a wave of relief. And I was able to not sleep well at night because we really didn't know what was going on in the pandemic, but I didn't have to worry about that part. And I know that there are so many people that did. And so that is one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about this work, is I want women to be economically empowered. I want them to have that financial independence, and I want them to ultimately have that choice and that freedom. But I want to go back and share a little bit more about how I actually got here, because I think it's kind of an interesting story, and I don't know if I've ever really shared it in full. So I grew up in a middle income household in Edmonton and went to university at the U of A. I was really good at math in high school, and I was told, like, you're good at math, go be an engineer. And I guess prior to starting university, once I was about 16, I really had this desire to make my own money. I didn't like asking my parents for money. We had allowances. They were kind of few and far between in that they weren't really consistent, but if we ever needed anything, we could ask our parents for money and they would likely give it to us. There were very few instances where they actually said no. But I didn't like asking for money. And I think that kind of still holds true today. I don't love asking for money, but it is something that is necessary as you move through your life. But I became very passionate about wanting to have my own money. So at 16, I ended up, my first job, other than I guess like random babysitting gigs, was as a hostess at a restaurant in the Edmonton area. And that was like the manager, I guess, took a chance on me. I had no work experience at that point, but I was making, I think it was like $7 an hour, maybe back then. And I remember getting my first paycheck and all of these deductions. I didn't actually make like the $7 an hour times, let's say 10 hours in the week. All of these deductions were taken off my pay. And I was like, what is happening? And that was my first foray into taxes, which is hilarious because I became a tax specialist. Anyways, we also received tips, and that was a really interesting way to earn money in addition to kind of having that paycheck, because sometimes our tips would actually be more than what our actual pay was. So I had that job. And then kind of as I got closer to 18, I had a serving job at an old folks home. I ended up working in retail for a little bit. I always had multiple jobs on the go, and that continued into my university years, which again, I think that's like the entrepreneurial spirit in me, is I was always trying to find ways to make money. Anyways, so went into engineering, hated it. Was like, this is actually the worst decision I've ever made in my life. And at that point, I had planned out my next 8 years. I was going into engineering. I was going to become a biomedical engineer, and then I was going to go to med school. And that was going to be the next 8 years of my life. And that blew up in my face the first semester. So I often say to young people, it's really important to know what you like doing, but I think it's even more important to know what you don't like doing. And when you find yourself in a space where you are not enjoying what you're doing, leave quickly. Don't wait and drag it out. Because if I had dragged out engineering for multiple years, I would have delayed so many different things. So I knew right away, I was like, this is terrible. I hate this. I'm switching faculties. So I ended up in the faculty of agriculture. I was going to be a nutritionist, and I took a lot of science classes. So I probably have half of a science degree. I like to say that. And I was taking an organic chemistry class and was struggling. I had this German professor that I could not understand. And it didn't help that a lot of the material in organic chemistry is a lot of chemistry terminology, which I guess makes sense. But that paired with the fact that I couldn't understand my prof was making it really challenging to do well in that class. And so I actually hired a tutor, and that tutor ended up being my husband. So that's like a little funny aside story. But as I was moving through that faculty, I took an option in human ecology, and the class was family finance. And that is kind of the first time that I actually was taught about money. And I ended up taking another human ecology class, and I still remember my prof, Patricia French, who I've connected with over the years. I haven't seen her in a while, but if she's listening to this, you are the reason that I'm in this field now as an entrepreneur. But in that class, we had to do a book report on a personal finance book. And the book I chose was The Automatic Millionaire. And that was the first time I was like, wait, my money can make money? I knew it in the sense of like interest at the bank, but that was always like a couple cents here, a couple cents there, very low interest rate. But this notion that my money could be invested and actually start to earn a substantial amount of money like I was hooked immediately. I started doing the calculations on how my money would grow. I remember marching into my bank. I was like an RBC student at this point, and I remember being like, I need to invest. I need to open an investment account. And I opened an RSP and I put $50 in, or 25. I can't remember actually how much. And I bought like 1 unit of a mutual fund. No idea what mutual fund I was invested in. That's a whole other aside. But I started contributing to it. And at this point, I was teaching dance while going to university. And I think I was making like $400 a month. And I was putting $25 into this investment account. And, it took 4 months to get to 100. And then all of a sudden, I started to make money on this money. And I was like, this is nuts. I'm not doing anything. My money is literally just making money by sitting there. And so that is really what started me into my passion for investing in personal finance. Nutritionist did not work out. I did not become a registered dietitian, and I ended up switching into the faculty of business. I took an accounting class, and it was like a light bulb went on and everything clicked. And I was like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. I probably should have realized that because both my parents are accountants, and maybe that's just the way our brains work. But I fought it for like 2 years. I was like, I'm not taking an accounting class. And then I finally took one. And yeah, everything clicked. And from there, it was history. I went through my accounting degree at the U of A. I did co-op terms, so I was earning money while I was doing my degree. I moved out of my parents' house and in with my then boyfriend, now husband. And we lived in downtown Edmonton. And I was, trying to make money so that we could pay rent and still invest. And the co-op terms really helped with that. But I was always working multiple jobs. One of the most interesting jobs I think I worked in university was I was a presenter with Money Mentors, and they are a not-for-profit here in Alberta that helps with debt repayment and bankruptcy. And I actually got to go into high schools and I presented to these high school students on financial education. And it was like the most fun job I've ever had. I loved the speaking aspect of it. I loved engaging with the young kids. And I think that ended up, it's so interesting looking back on your life, because I think that ended up being one of the reasons I was actually hired in my tech role. So I was finishing up my accounting degree and I started a personal finance blog. And then I kind of figured out at that point that you could get paid for writing. So I wrote for a number of financial institutions. The first one I think I did some ghostwriting for. I think I made $13 to $20 an article, which is so low. But I was like, this is another stream of income. This is another way I can make money. And I remember I was, going to university during the day, studying into the evening, and then blogging at night. And I was just telling my personal finance story and all of the kind of things that I was experiencing as I was going through, my co-op terms, and how I was learning to invest and what I was doing with my money and how I was setting up my emergency fund and my spending accounts. And that was really fun. And once I was done my degree, I moved down to Calgary. I'd done a co-op term here and then came back to article at one of the big 4 accounting firms. And they had a tax rotational program. So that's what I entered. And I ultimately did my CPA with a depth in taxation. So I was a tax auditor for some of the biggest companies in Canada. I also did a stint in audit as well and did a lot of tax compliance for cross-border individuals, but also corporations. So spent some time there. That job sucked my soul dry, I think. And we were working crazy hours. We were being paid very little. And there was just a lot of toxic masculinity and patriarchy there. And I remember it was after my designation, I was a senior accountant and I was kind of coming up for promotion, coming up for raises that they kind of have every single year. And at the time, I think I was making $57,000 a year as a designated CPA. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go in there, I'm going to negotiate. And if I can get 65, then I'll be laughing. That's a great raise. And then I started training this guy. They had just hired him. I do not remember his name, but I'm grateful to him every day because for some reason we got on the topic of salaries. And I think up until this point in my life, I was obviously a big advocate for women. I had attended women's conferences, but I never really thought these things maybe impacted me specifically. And then I found out I was training this guy who's in the exact same role as I was, and he was making $70,000. Yeah. So he was making $13,000 more than I was, which was like 23% of my pay at that point. And I remember just being like irate. I was furious. I was seeing red. And I just remember being like, oh my God, this is like so unfair. So went into that partner's office, ended up negotiating, walked out with $72,000. So I'm very proud of that moment. But had I not known what that guy was being paid, I would have taken a not $65,000 raise. I would have taken a raise to $65,000 and thought that that was good. And I would still have been $5,000 underpaid. So when we are looking, and we will explore all of this in the podcast over the next who knows how many seasons. But when we're talking about equal pay, I think men do have a role to play in sharing what they make and having those conversations with their female counterparts so that, we are getting to the point where we can actually bring equality to the table. So in my time at that accounting firm, also ended up getting married at that point, went on a wonderful honeymoon to Bali and Hong Kong, and then realized that this was not the job for me. I did not want to stare at my computer screen for 15 hours a day. I was not that passionate about tax. I remember I was in like an in-depth tax course, and we were arguing over the placement of a comma, and it's like half lawyers, half accountants, and how moving the comma could mean something different for tax purposes. And I was like, I hate this. This is so annoying. I really don't care where the comma is placed. I need to get out of here. And I must have been having like a bad day, week, month, but we would always get like recruiters reaching out to us on LinkedIn to come work at a different accounting firm, like same sort of thing. And I was never interested in that because I was like, I'm not going to go to the same type of company, kind of same shit, different pile. Anyways, a recruiter reached out about this opportunity with a tech company that I had never heard of. I honestly didn't even know it existed. So I must have been having a bad day because I decided to take the interview. I decided to take the call and ended up at that company for 5 years. And at that company, I got to work with so many different types of businesses. I learned so much about how different businesses run their business processes and their financial softwares. And I worked with really amazing people and got to explore so many different types of companies across Canada and the US and even some in Europe, and worked with CFOs and controllers and HR and IT. So it was a really cool job in the sense that I basically got paid to speak. And that is something that I'm obviously very, very passionate about. So we would go in and we would do like a 8-hour presentation. And yeah, your voice was like shot afterwards, but it was so fun. I really, really enjoyed that job. And I think one of the main things that got me that job, other than obviously my accounting knowledge, was the fact that I had that speaking experience at Money Mentors. And so while I was working at that company, I think I was still writing. I was still blogging and writing for financial institutions off the side of my desk. My blog back then was My Pennies, My Thoughts. And I was also starting to speak to kind of smaller groups in the Calgary area and some across Canada. But like I spoke to Next Gen Men and YYC Girl Gang. And there were a lot of different like little groups that were bringing me in to run these financial education sessions. And I knew that this was something I was passionate about. And so I was starting to look at like how to build my business and how to create a business. Because at that point I had just been doing stuff off the side of my desk. I would take like a speaking engagement or be paid to write or what have you. And, it amounted to a few $1,000s a year. It was a great second source of income, but I knew that I wanted to create something that was kind of bigger than that for myself. And the pandemic hit. Or we started this podcast actually before the pandemic hit. So Tara and I decided we were going to start a podcast because we would end up like just sitting and having a glass of wine and chatting about all these things when it came to our finances, but also how the systems that are in place actually impact all of those things. And when we were exploring a lot of the like systemic themes, so many parts of being a woman came up. So, in the tech space and in the accounting field, I was always told I was too young or I looked too young. I got told at one point that I didn't look like enough of an accountant. And I was like, what does an accountant look like? I knew exactly what they meant because I was replaced by a middle-aged white guy. But, coming up against some of those challenges really sucked. And so I wanted to talk about those things. And I wanted to talk about the systemic injustices that we face as women. And of course, we know as soon as there's marginalized women, as soon as there's neurodivergent women, as soon as there's disabled women, those all make all of these challenges just that much harder. And so Tara and I started the podcast, and then the pandemic hit. And 4 days into lockdown, I was in Quebec. I think it was like one of the last flights back. 4 days into lockdown, I found out I was pregnant. And it was like a very planned pregnancy. Like we were trying, and not that I need to justify that, but I guess we're surprised it happened so quickly, and that we were in this crazy pandemic thing. And at that point we were like, 2 weeks to bend the curve. There's no way, this is March. I was like, there's no way this pandemic will still be going on in November when I give birth. Spoiler alert, it was like the height of the third wave and there was no vaccines. So that was cool in the worst way possible. Anyways, at that point, I really also decided that I wanted to create a business. So I incorporated in early 2020 the Wealth Building Academy. So we've been around for 5 years, I guess now. And I started building a course, an investing course, because it was a question that I always got. And at that point, I started, filming and getting my materials together and putting together this course for people to learn how to invest online. And I wanted to make it specifically for women so that women had a place where they could go and ask questions. And that part of my business has been great. The speaking part of it has also been fantastic, but we couldn't really do that in the pandemic. I also started writing my book when I was like 8 months pregnant, which in hindsight, maybe not the best move, but we also had nothing else to do at that time. I knew I wanted to write a book that was about financial education, but I also didn't want to exclude all of the challenges women face, because I really felt at that time that we were saying like women have less wealth because they buy too many shoes or purses or makeup, and lattes are why we can't retire, and avocado toast is why we can't have houses. And I was just like, this cannot be it. Like there's no way we would have figured it out. And so that is when I started writing my book. And I just knew that it kind of had to include both things. So the Pink Tax, Dismantling a Financial System Designed to Keep Women Broke, talks about, practical advice and steps you can take, but also explores the systems that hold women back. And I'm really proud of it. It took me 2.5 years from the start of writing to the published date. There was also a child born in that time period, so I did take some time off from writing. And I'm really proud that it's out in the world. There's been great feedback. There's been people who hate it because they think I'm too left-leaning, which, spoiler alert, I'm very, very left-leaning. But during the pandemic, I had my son in November of 2020. He's now, at the time of recording, almost 5 years old, which is insane to me. I can't believe I almost have a 5-year-old. And that's going to make me like teary-eyed. But he's grown up so fast. So if you're a new parent, don't blink. I know everyone tells you that. But I was building this business. I went back to work. I had a 1-year-old. I was building a business. I was working in corporate. I was working on my book. I started my master's program. So I'm doing a master's in economic sustainability. I have 3 classes left. And I was also sitting on a number of boards, and I just felt like there was so much going on and I knew something had to give. So I went back to corporate for about a year and then left corporate. And that was right around the time, it was like a couple months to my book launch, and I haven't looked back. I definitely deal with imposter syndrome and the ups and downs of being an entrepreneur. It is not for the faint of heart. There are so many days where I'm like, oh my God, what am I doing? I should apply for a job. And then there are days where I'm like, this is the best thing I've ever done in my life. And I get to actually have control over my schedule. I can make money doing this, and I get to live life on my terms and in a way that's impactful to me. And I get to do work that I love and talk to women every single day that are passionate about the same things that I am. And that is so, so rewarding. So the last thing I'll say about my story is I also decided that I was going to start a conference. in my first year of entrepreneurship, which again, maybe I should have waited a year or two, but I'm also of the opinion that like you may as well do it. You may as well try it, fail fast. And if you don't like it or if something doesn't work out, you pivot. And I think I've held that belief again, starting from a very young age in university when I hated engineering. So that has served me well over the years. And my conference is now coming into its third year, and the conference is called Wealthy Her, and it's in Calgary in April of 2026. So if you're interested in finding more details about that, you can go to thatswealthbuilding.com/her, and there will be details for tickets there. And one of my favorite things about the conference is I get to curate a group of speakers that really are passionate about educating women. And we don't just talk about money. We talk about financial well-being. We talk about how money impacts your mental health. We talk about spiritual money. We talk about fitness and money. Really, it is kind of everything that you could want in a one-day conference. I created it because I love International Women's Day and I think it's great to celebrate women, but I really felt that the tools were being left out of International Women's Day. So how do we make more money? How do we negotiate better? How do we invest? We didn't have those tools. And so that's why I created Wealthy Her. So I would love to see you there. If you're honestly anywhere in Canada or the US and you want to travel, there is space for you at this table. And to be honest, I haven't found a conference that's anything like what I've created. And so I'm really, really proud of the fact that we're coming into our third year. So now every day I get to spend working on the conference. I get to talk to businesses and people that care about women's economic equality and prosperity. And I get to teach women how to actually build their wealth. And that is my hope for this podcast. I want this to be a place where you can learn about money and feel safe. I want this to be a place where you can learn what other women are doing and what other experiences they've had and the biases that impact our ability to build wealth, because it is quite sinister when you kind of dive into all the areas that we are impacted in how we actually earn and build wealth. And I also want you to be able to fight the systems. I want you to be able to advocate for yourself. I want you to know that you can talk to men about their salaries and then turn around and advocate for a raise at work. I think those are skills we don't talk about. Companies don't like it when you talk about that either. But I think it's something that's so, so important because I truly believe you only have one life. And we may as well do everything in our power to live it in the most fulfilling way. And while sometimes the days can feel really long, I do feel like the years are short. And I know that's cliche, but again, I have a 5-year-old and I don't know how that happened. And time is going to pass regardless. So you may as well actually enjoy the life you're living. And I think money is a tool that allows us to do that. I don't think money is the be all and end all. Again, it's a resource that we get to allocate. And I think it's really important that we choose how we allocate that money. So thank you for joining me this week on the first episode of the revamped Pink Tax podcast. I am so excited for this journey that we're going to go on. I maybe have at least 4 seasons planned out. So you're with me for at least that long. And we'll see where this takes us. I really do want it to be a place where we can talk about everything when it comes to being a woman. So my inbox is always open. You can email me hello@JanineRogan.com. If you have a guest that you want to suggest, I would love to have them on the show. If you have a resource you want to share, please let me know. If you have a topic you want covered, I love digging into research. Like I said, I'm 3/4 of the way through my master's, so send that my way. I love connecting with all of you. Please make sure that you go follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn and TikTok. I think we'll probably have a TikTok at some point, probably just my personal TikTok, which is @JanineRogan. And our Instagram is Pink Tax Show. And I wanted to leave you with a couple of resources if you're curious about learning more. So obviously my book, and I'm pointing right beside me, I have many copies of the Pink Tax. You can purchase that or borrow it from the library. There is an audiobook version where I read it to you. So definitely check that out. You can also head over to my website, that'swealthbuilding.com. And I have a number of resources that are free and some that are paid. So I have a 25-step financial checklist that you can download. I have a TFSA guide, and I also have a financial feminism IQ test. All of those will be linked in the description for this show below. And I also have a few paid resources. I have my template vault, which is $39, and it goes through all of the templates, or you get access to all of the templates that I've used over the years to build my wealth. And of course, the conference is coming up. So I would love to have you at the conference. I would love to have you in the room. You can find more information about that at that'swealthbuilding.com/her. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I can't wait to bring our first guest on next week. And I hope you have a wonderful and wealthy week ahead. And that's a wrap on this week's episode of The Pink Tax. Thank you for joining me on the front lines of financial fairness. Remember, understanding the cost of being a woman is just the start. Now it's time to demand your worth and build your wealth. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a step in dismantling systemic inequality and securing your financial future. If this episode sparked a fire in you, take a screenshot, tag us on social media, and share it with a friend who needs to join the movement. Until next time, keep your wallet guarded, your eyes open, and let's keep fighting for a world where pink is just a color, not a tax bracket.